Head of Human Resources at Viz Media. It's a leading publisher of English language versions of Japanese manga. In her role, Connie has helped Viz grow from 120 to 170 employees. And are you still hiring? You still have oh yeah, I'm sure. While navigating the company's transition to remote and hybrid work during the COVID pandemic. Connie is passionate about connecting with and creating learning opportunities for talent of diverse backgrounds, hoping to break into publishing. Right? And then we also have Tomokimura, who is joining us from Tokyo today. Tomo is
Hello.
an ex software engineer who has been translating manga since 2004. She is translating Karukiyo Bed and Breakfast for Spirits and Beastars for Viz Media, as well as Black Butler for Yen Press. And Tomo also teaches manga translation at Fellows Academy. It's a translation school in Tokyo. And let's see, next we have, oops. Oh, let me get this, sorry. All right, and then we have Andrea Colvin. Andrea is the editorial director of graphic publishing at Little Brown Books for Young Readers. She joined Little Brown in July 2019 to curate a list of graphic novels for the youngest readers through middle grade, teen, and YA. Her debut list with Little Brown published in spring 2021 and include the middle grade graphic novels Just Pretend by Tori Sharp, Shark Summer by Ira Marks, and Lilla the Accidental Witch by Eleanor Cruz. She was also most recently the editor-in-chief of independent comics publisher Lionforge, where she acquired such well-received graphic novels as Mooncakes by Suzanne Walker and Wendy Zhu, No Ivy League by Hazel Newlevent, and Genderqueer, a memoir by Maya Kobabe. And last but not least, we have Carley, Dr. Carley, who is the senior editor at Yen Press in the manga editorial department. He has contributed to the Eisner Award-nominated Laid Back Camp, Skullface bookseller Honda-san, one of my personal favorites, and Run With Your New Legs, as well as the Uncle from Another World, which is a big hit now on Netflix. Carl earned his PhD from Leiden University in the Netherlands, impressive, where he wrote his dissertation, Normal Feelings in Abnormal Worlds, on the political uses of emotion in science fiction manga. That's right, you can get a PhD in manga, people. All right, let's get started. I guess I want to preface this conversation like what we're going to be talking about today is not just about manga publishing or, just even comics publishing. We're talking about, I guess, getting into this business and whether having multi-language skills is a plus, and what other kinds of things should people who are interested in getting into this work should be aware of. So I know, Andrea, you mentioned that you teach as well. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I teach a class on and off in the NYU MS in publishing program that's about graphic novel publishing. And, it's interesting because we cover, I actually had to learn about manga, which I'm sure I say wrong because everyone else is saying
Okay.
manga, to teach that section of this class because I, am a very American, graphic novel comics person. But it's an overview of just the comics publishing business in the United States.
Got it. So who takes your class, or what kind of students?
So there are graduate students in this program who are looking to get jobs in publishing. A lot of them want to be editors. Some of them want to be creators. Some of them are also writers, and a lot of them end up in marketing roles.
Mm,
As well, which is something that I think people shouldn't discount who are trying to get into comics publishing, because I do think certainly in the book world and the direct market comics world, in my experience, there's a lot of lateral movement between the marketing and editorial groups.
that's a good point. So maybe this brings me to Connie, but when people talk about getting a job in manga, in comics and manga publishing, a lot of them just think it's being an editor. But what kind of roles are generally, that people can consider getting into in this industry?
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a lot of people involved in getting a book published. From the very beginning, there's people involved in the acquisitions process and making those decisions, people involved in licensing. So, speaking with the licensors where we're getting that IP, for Viz specifically, those tend to be Japanese licensors. And so, that is a non editorial role that does require bilingual skills in Japanese. And then, in addition to the actual editorial work, there's also copy editing, and then production too, which does occasionally require some coordination with the licensors, but a little bit less than on the editorial and licensing sides.
Got it. Are there uh, certain positions that are more challenging to fill, or
I think each role can be challenging in its own ways because publishing as a whole is a smaller industry, and then to find people who have an interest and skill set related to graphic novels and manga is an even smaller group.
Hmm,
um, some of the challenges are, of course, for some of the roles, the language skills, and then just in general, people who have experience working with sequential content, whether that's graphic novels or video games, animation, or anything else in that sphere that could translate well into editorial roles at Viz.
got it. So, Carl, I know as an editor, you hire freelancers as well as staff at your. What kind of? I guess Gin Press has grown quite a bit
Mhm.
since you started 15 years ago. Can you tell me a little bit more about how things have changed at your company and what kind of you know I guess what kind of roles are there at your company?
Well, I have not been in all 15 years. But even for the amount of time I joined, which is roughly 5 years, a little more than that, things have changed quite a bit. Like the amount of staff has grown tremendously. Um, like I think it's at least doubled since I
Wow.
started. And there you have editors, manga editors. You have light novel editors because we have a robust light novel division, but you also have design, who's in charge of, say, like adapting and making covers and logos. You have marketing, of course. Then this is all internal staff. Accounting, production is a big part of it as well. And then managing editorial, which sometimes is called production editorial, depending on the company. But essentially, they are. I think most of those positions are probably pretty self-explanatory. Production are the basically the employees who liaison with the printers, the ones, and kind of basically get the material we make in-house and send it out, and coordinate with the printers. And then managing editorial is usually in charge of working with freelance proofreaders, but also kind of copy editing and other similar tasks. We do hire freelancers. We mentioned freelance proofread- proofreaders, freelance translators, and freelance letterers. So those are the big ones. Because especially when it comes to the manga side, the there's both the aspect of translating the Japanese into English, and then laying it out, and kind of cleaning the balloons, scrubbing the Japanese where necessary, and adding the English text. And that's kind of a very simplified version of what happens.
Got it. So speaking of freelancers, Tomo, I understand you're a freelance translator and you've been doing this for a while. What, I guess maybe my question is, one, how do you get into this? And I know you're a teacher, so what are you teaching your students and what are they looking for?
Well, the way I started was that I just happened to have a friend who was working at Viz at that time. And this was back in 2004. And I just got an email from her saying, well, we're going to publish more shoujo manga, and we need people who can translate shoujo manga. So if you're interested, would you like to apply and take our translation test? And I did. And I had to choose one manga to translate. It was just like the first 10, 12 pages. And I chose Full Moon. And then when I submitted it, I later heard back from an editor saying, we've already licensed it. I'm in charge of it. I like your translation, so would you like to do it for real? And that was how I got my first job. I mean, I've never done any sort of like language study, so I can't really tell people, well, you need to study this sort of thing if you want to become a professional translator. But I grew up in Japan, but I attended international schools, so I've had all my education in English. And then I went to the US for college and grad school. So that's obviously helped a lot um, with my English. Because in a way, I'm more comfortable writing English than I do writing Japanese, because I've written a lot more English. And as for my manga class, what I do now is a one-shot recorded lecture. So the students can just listen it for like 3 weeks, as many times as you want. And what I do now is like an intro to manga translation. So I go over the basic stuff, like you have to translate everything, the sound effects, the undercovers, the afterwards. You have to take care of everything, just even the back cover copies, stuff like that. Because when I get the questionnaires back, it's like, oh, I thought you just had to translate the dialogues. You do complicated stuff like translating sound effects. That I mean, I've got reactions like that because most people who take my classes haven't read any English manga. Well, I mean, even in Tokyo, you'd have to go to Kinokuniya in Shinjuku if you want paper English manga books, and even there, their selection isn't that huge. I mean, they do have an English manga corner and an English light novel corner, but that's in addition to the English magazines corner and the English bestseller novels corner. So it's not like they have a huge stock. And well, if you go to Amazon, you can buy English manga on Kindle, but I guess people don't read it as much as they do English novels. So some of the other reaction I've got is like, oh, English manga is great for studying English conversation. And people tell me, oh, maybe I should read some manga to like practice colloquial English.
I see.
Yeah, and with the intermediate class, we actually have students translate a couple of pages from an actual manga, and then explain why I chose to translate lines a certain way. And I also explain stuff like, well, stuff like, when you in manga, sometimes you have to break up lines into different bubbles, right? But depending on how you break your lines, the nuance can change slightly.
Yep.
So that's sort of the things I explain.
That's a challenge, particularly with Japanese, because Japanese is written vertically, not horizontally. So a lot of times, a lot of Japanese comics creators make word balloons that are tall and thin.
Yes.
And then sometimes the translation for a word is quite long and it's awkward. So sometimes I've noticed that as an editor or as a translator, you have to make choices to make it fit in the bubble. And that
So
it
I
may
do
not be a
try to
one-to-one.
make it as short as possible.
Yeah,
To try to keep it compact.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay,
And
Andrea, sorry.
I also talk about like how you make sound effects.
Yes.
So, how to develop new ones from existing ones by, like tweaking with the spelling or maybe adding a vowel. So if it's like key, it's like, well, you can add a couple of E's to, emphasize that sort of stuff.
It's very challenging it's very different to edit graphic novels than it is to edit novels, obviously. So Andrea, maybe I want to ask you a little bit about like what kind of skills or what kind of things does a graphic novel editor have to keep in mind?
So, well, I will say that people ask me all the time, do you have to be an artist to be a graphic novel editor because it's art? And I say no, but you have to have a sense of visual storytelling, because unlike, prose novels, graphic novels, it's not, it's sequential art, it's sequential storytelling. So it's not just pictures that decorate or support the dialogue and the words. The images have to carry at least half the storytelling load. So you have to be able to understand when that's working and when it isn't. And honestly, I think the best way to do that is just to read as widely and as much as possible in the area that you want to work in. I know everyone says this, but I really recommend Scott McCloud's books, including Understanding Comics and Making Comics, that I think have helped me be a better editor. He's very good at taking the things that maybe you feel in your gut and sort of attaching these more academic terms to them. So, I think like anything, and maybe this goes into, I know we're going to talk a little bit about fandom. I think you have to love it, like you're not going to be really good at most things unless you really love them and enjoy them. You have to want to read comics in your spare time. You don't have to want to read all comics, but I just think it's really important. And I found in hiring people too, just in general throughout my career in various roles, I have better luck with people who maybe don't have great experience, but clearly want the job and want to do this work, than people who might have more traditional experience, but are not as enthusiastic about the job.
Connie, I see you nodding. Would you like to add a little bit to that?
Yeah, I definitely agree. You need to find folks who are really passionate about the content, but also balance that out with people who have an understanding of being professional and knowing where the line is between the business needs and what you might want to do as a creative or as somebody who is a fan of the content that you're working on, because unfortunately things don't always work out perfectly, and you have to be able to decide, at the end of the day, we're trying to make a profit out of the products, and sometimes you have to, make some tough choices there. So somebody who understands that while bringing in that enthusiasm and that passion at the same time. And I definitely agree that the experience isn't as important as somebody who's willing to put in the effort and really curious about how to do the best job possible.
Can I just say, I just wanted what Connie just said about this being a business. I just wanted to reiterate that, because I do think that's really important. And we get into, jobs that we love, and we're also lucky to be doing things that we love. But I would say, like, I'm a fan of all the creators I work with, but we do have to make money so that we can all continue to work together and work here. So that's an important point. Thanks for bringing it up.
So, Carl, I also are you bilingual, by the way?
Let's see. I speak English, Japanese, and I grew up speaking Cantonese, so I'd say like 2.5 lingual is the best way I can put it. Maybe trilingual, you'd argue. Can't really read Chinese is the sticking point, but I'd say yeah.
Do you find how does your language skill, your skills in other languages help, or I don't know, is it important in your work now? Would you do you find that that's a big deciding factor on whether you get like two equal candidates and you get, oh well, this one can speak Japanese or Korean and this one can't?
I mean, I think at least at Yen, for the editorial positions, we almost always want someone with some Japanese skills or more recently Korean skills, because even on the manga side, where it's not where like the high level Japanese is not quite as required as on the light novel side, it's still an important skill to have, because part of the editor's job is to take the translator's work and spruce it up. And translators are great. We have plenty of fantastic translators, including Tomo. Actually, she does Black Butler for us. Just really great work. But nobody's perfect. Editors aren't perfect. Translators aren't perfect, and so sometimes stuff slips through the cracks. So having that extra layer of language skill can help to catch things. And the better you are at Japanese, of course, or the the original language, the better you are at probably catching those issues. But even having like a very basic, let's say like let's say a Japanese language proficiency JLPT, Japanese language proficiency test level 3 or ish, you can still sometimes catch if things are a little strange. Though I
For
do want
example,
to
like any stories come to mind?
just like Japanese is a I'd say a notoriously context sensitive language.
Hmm.
So there are literal times where there are lines which on paper make sense, but because one character came from 1,000 years ago and another character is from space, the context of the words they're using changes the meaning. You have to kind of adjust accordingly, and something that um, requires both, I think, in a sense, we're saying bilingual in the sense of, oh, this person knows English and also this other language. But the English side is also important because learning how to take that nuance and adjust it into natural sounding English is also important. Um, I do want to also say as well that sometimes it's almost like there's being strong in the original language, Japanese, Korean, or whatever, and being strong in English in the target language, English in this case. But there's also sort of experience reading comics or reading manga, because I think that even someone who doesn't necessarily have like fantastic Japanese can read a page and then as an editor and be like, wait a second, that didn't make sense. I know these characters. I know how the
Mhm.
story's flowing. I know how these stories typically go. Why would this character say this in this case? And then you go and look around, or maybe you ask someone and be like, oh, what do you think of this? Do you think I think something's off here? Do you agree? And then they might be like, yeah, I think something's off too. And then you can sort of investigate if the line didn't quite hit the mark. And it's so I guess what it's saying is that I'm just reiterating that Japanese or whatever language is important, the bilingual skills can be extremely useful. It's not the only skill, but also I think in the context of Yen in particular, we work at a pretty fast pace. So having the editors also know the languages also speeds up the process instead of having to like send it back to the translator and be like, hey,
Mhm.
what do you think?
Right, right, right. I always hear in comics, it's fast, cheap, or good. Pick two, and sometimes just one. So in I guess maybe I'll ask this to Tomo. It's like fast, cheap, or good. Which is the most important?
Good and fast.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, quality is important, but I also have to meet deadlines, right?
Hmm.
So I've got to compromise somewhere if I have to. So it's quality by, a, but I definitely have to finish it by a certain time.
Got it. Got it.
I want to actually say something as well that I just remembered
Yes.
based on what Tomo said is that it's good to have people who feel that sting when they didn't quite like I've had the experience where like I'll finalize something and I send into the printer, it's done, and then I'm like, oh, I should have picked this word instead,
Hmm.
and it hurts a little bit, but the ability to feel that way, but also not get yourself bogged down by it. I think that kind of balancing of speed and accuracy is something that Tomo was mentioning that really rung true to me.
Yeah, because if I try to do everything perfect, I'm never going to finish it.
Right. Right. Right.
I mean, I can just keep tweaking it forever and then never turn my script in. But I mean, I can't do that as a business, right?
Right. Right.
Because the book will never get out.
Yeah. There. Books publishing is about deadlines. That's for sure. Um, Andrea, I think one thing that comes up with this panel, and maybe because I'm really familiar with manga and what I do feel like there is, like I noticed that Lion Forge licensed a lot of books from France and from Spain. And do you feel, and now you're at Little Brown, do you find that Spanish and French skills are also in demand in graphic novels, or not quite?
I've definitely spent more time wishing I could read French than in my job than any other
Is that
language
right?
besides English. You know, Funnily enough, when I was applying for the job at Lion Forge, they sent me I think 4 or 5 French graphic novels to evaluate to see, you know, if I thought we should acquire them. And they sent them to me, and I was like, well, these are in French. And, and the person who was hiring at the time was like, well, if you don't understand French, this job is going to be really hard for you. And I
Wow.
was like, well, that's bananas, because we're not publishing in French. And so I mean, it took me a long time. I did a lot of Bing Translate, enough to get a sense of what the books were. I mean, obviously, any that we acquired, we used translators for. But right now, in my role, releasing graphic novels to the book trade, the books, the only things I look at generally that aren't, originals that, are coming from the US are French graphic novels. And that is, it's always an issue that I can't read French. So, it would be great if someone could. However, the industry is changing a little bit. Like it used to be, like in Random House Graphic, for instance, published for their first list like a number of French imports because it's a way to get a list out quickly. It's a long time to make original graphic novels. In these, the art is already done. You translate, you reset the text. But the graphic novel market has just ballooned so much in the United States for original content that at this point my pipeline is so full that I'm barely looking for anything anymore, let alone French content that has there isn't a huge market for it in the US the way there is for manga. So you have to do a lot more kind of turning it into something that the casual reader won't recognize as European.
Got it.
So, and sometimes it's just more exciting and fun to find new creators and, get their original work.
That makes sense. I was kind of curious because, obviously Japanese, Korean, Chinese is not the only language out there in graphic novels. So I was wondering whether you were noticing any trends in that regard.
Yeah,
And now,
we're moving away from it.
is that right?
But what's really interesting too, when the pandemic, in the pandemic, when there's this huge uptick in manga reading, I, had my bosses come to me and saying, hey, did you know that manga's, a big thing now? Can we do manga? We need manga. And I was like, well, that's not American comics. Like that's not original, it wouldn't be manga. But interestingly, so what I told them is like, well, there is a visual language to manga and we can look for projects that incorporate that in some ways. And I think we're seeing that trend a lot in the kinds of things that I'm publishing. But, it's an interesting discussion to have.
That's for sure. So I guess, Connie, one of the questions I want to ask is like, not everyone at Viz speaks Japanese. What's the percentage roughly about at your company, do you think?
I think it's really department specific. Some departments is 100% bilingual and some are 0%.
Really? Okay. Like, for example?
I mean, obviously your G&A departments don't need to speak Japanese because, accounting and finance and HR, it's fine. We're a US based company. And even marketing, design, and some of the other teams involved in the publishing process, the Japanese language skills aren't necessary. Even our editorial team is probably only 50% Japanese bilingual. We do, like at Yen Press, as Carl mentioned, rely heavily on freelance translators to do the initial pass, and then the editors don't necessarily need to have Japanese fluency to work on the content, but it does help for, as Carl mentioned, some of those sticking points. And I just also wanted to add, sorry to go back to Andrew's previous answer, Viz is actually involved in a similar project where we do have original manga publishing, where we are scouting creators and artists directly for non-Japanese licensed content, because there is a visual language to manga, as you described, and there's must be an appetite out there for that. And so we're trying to find some titles that might work in the US. And interestingly, those teams do require Japanese fluency because we are working a lot of the times with Japan-based artists, since they're
Oh,
used to
wow.
working in that art style. And in order to scout and pass notes back and forth as you're working through the graphic novel process, you definitely need a strong fluency level to be in that space all the time. So we have an open role on that team, and that one is particularly hard to fill, somebody who's used to being that type of editor while being incredibly fluent in Japanese.
Got it. So what kind of skills are you looking for in that role? Just curious.
So this one's different than our manga editors, because our manga editors aren't actually fulfilling your traditional editorial role where they are working directly with authors on content. We've received, basically the fully finished product from Japan, and we're doing a localization into the US market. And so there's a lot more stuff on the back end. So working with the translators and letters and then production. For the original actually following the more traditional publishing process, there is the scouting of talent, there is the working back and forth with the creators to finesse the content. And so somebody that comes from that type of background or understands that entire publishing process, who has connections with creators, who knows how to do things like portfolio reviews, and then has connections in Japan and the US, knows how to
Wow.
work with potential licensing partners like Disney or Marvel, and then of course the Japanese fluency on top of all of that.
I,
So it's a lot.
I sure hope whoever you hire is getting paid a lot, because that's a lot on their
Yeah,
plate. Boy.
it's a lot of talent to try to fit into one role.
It's for sure, for sure. Carl, are you guys experiencing? I know you guys have done some explosive growth too. About how is language skills, I guess, spread around your team?
Well, again, the editorial department, everybody has some level of Japanese skills. It's not as necessary, say, in the design department or marketing. Curiously, our accounting staff does have quite a few Japanese speakers, but I think that might have to do with our close connections with a parent company, one of our parent companies, Kadokawa, which is a major Japanese media company, as well as with the Shet, the other side of it. So I think that might be why, but I don't have any sort of deep insight into the accounting side. Managing editorial also doesn't really have Japanese language skills, nor does production. It's not necessarily needed there. Sort of like on the med ed side, their job is mainly to treat it like a purely English text and read it that way. It's up to editors to and the translators, of course, to work on the Japanese side or the Korean side, as it were.
Got it. So I guess, Tomo, you've been working in this field as a freelancer for a while. Have you noticed any changes in the job market, or how, I guess, how your clients are, what they're asking for, or the work, or anything in particular that's a challenge, that's either a challenge or you see as being a new opportunity that's popping up for you?
Actually, I don't know that many people who actually do manga translation.
Hmm.
So I'm not, and since I'm based in Japan, I'm I'm not really familiar with the current trends. I mean, personally, I'm started getting some offers to do video game text,
Hmm.
and because I get messages from LinkedIn through LinkedIn saying, well, if you can translate manga dialogue, I think you can do some game dialogues too. And that was how I got my first job. Like I had
Hmm.
no experience, but the translation agency was willing to let me take a test, saying, well, you can just start up by translating the dialogue part first.
Hmm.
And then, so I took their test and then I passed it. And for a while, all they gave me was dialogue text.
Okay.
Yes. So that I could start out by doing something I was comfortable doing
Mhm.
with. And now I've started to do MTP, the post editing, machine translated stuff.
Hmm.
So I use a cat tool, and whatever the cat tool can't handle is all machine translated. And then so I do some post editing, and then sometimes, well, most of the time I have to do some sort of editing. So then then sometimes I have to translate from scratch to fix it.
Got it. Got it.
But from that experience, I'd say don't use it for manga.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, being bilingual is not just about having language skills, it's also about understanding the cultural context of the
Mhm.
material, and as well as, it's just so much more than just word, this word means this word, you
Right,
know.
right.
And then I think Connie, we were mentioning earlier that, and I think Carl, we were talking about this earlier, that, you know, it's more important to know how to write well and express yourself well in the target language. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I think that was mostly you, Carl, so I'll let you answer.
Oh, your mic.
Oh, sorry. Could you repeat that last part? I got a little sidetracked.
Oh, it's a little bit about, like, all the other things being equal, like, I think we mentioned, like, just having good writing skills in the target language is almost more important than having that second language skill.
Oh yes, I'd say so because it's kind of funny, like, sometimes, when we're hiring, looking for translators, right? Um, they might have strong Japanese skills, like, let's say, like, excellent Japanese skills, but maybe their experience lies in conversing with native Japanese speakers, or maybe doing something in a different field, like some sort of like finance or um, aeronautical engineering. I just made that up. We have not got any hired from aeronautical engineers. But ultimately, what it comes down to is making a readable product, and so having that skill to kind of make a character who's very poetic sound poetic in English, make a character who's very gruff in Japanese sound very gruff in English. Because I guess, kind of in a general sense, my approach is I want people reading the English to feel similar things to the way that someone reading in Japanese would feel from moment to moment, from page to page, from scene to scene. And I think that is the gist of it. That's why the English, the writing skill, right, the ability to have a way with words is so important in ultimately in the business.
Right, right. I mean, my day job is I work in UX, user experience design, and a lot of times, like, you write for different audiences, right? Like, if you're writing for a technical audience, you have a different tone. If you're writing during marketing part, it's a different tone or style than it is when you're dealing with a technical support issue, which you write in a much more neutral style. Like, there's all kinds of nuances to language and knowing how to express that, because sometimes, as you were saying with manga, right? I mean, these characters have different voices or different experiences, or and sometimes I've seen that expressed in, like, someone from Osaka talking, like, with a southern twang, which I always found a little weird, but it's a decision, you know. We have a question here from someone who's watching, so let me see if I can put this out here to the panel. Um, is there an example of from Edson Atwood? He's saying, is there an example of something that is a visual language that is difficult to translate for an English speaking market? Anyone want to jump in on that one?
I can sort of jump in. I think it might not be as much of the case anymore because so many people now have grown up reading manga in English from their libraries. We're getting so many people being like, I grew up reading Sailor Moon from the library, right? But I think one thing is a panel flow. Just like, I think it's called nagare, like the flow of panels, because if you even go back maybe like 5-10 years, you have people criticizing manga being it's so confusing to read. Like, how to make my eyes, and I don't even mean the reading right to left. I mean the way that one panel is and one is meant to lead into another, lead into another, lead into another. I think manga is kind of famous for having fairly intricate paneling, especially shoujo manga and josei manga. Like, sorry, girls manga and manga for women in terms of a traditional target demographic, because they can be almost like collages. They have very like sparse use of text because you kind of wanted to engage it, almost like engage with the page as a whole. And I think that again nowadays more and more artists outside of the manga industry um, and as well as readers are getting accustomed to it. But I think it took quite a while for that to happen. Um, so that's probably the example I think of.
Yeah, I think manga does have a unique visual language that sometimes, like that little squitch mark that's supposed to symbolize like your throbbing veins on your forehead. It's like, and I'm so used to reading that. I always wonder like what people think when they encounter manga's unique visual language for the first time. Like, does it make sense to them? So I guess
Well,
I'll throw this at you, Andrew, because
yeah, we have so much of that in original Western comics now that we're starting to understand it. I mean, my first exposure to that visual language was really in the Berry Brook Middle School series by Svetlana
Ah,
Shirokova that
mm,
Yen publishes.
mhm.
That's sort of where I started to learn, like what it means when you have like the dark brow, and everything is blue, or with the sweat beads, or just the idea that you can have characters with really detailed faces, and then you can have them with like really just representational features, and it means something different. It's a really exciting um, visual language, but because so many Western creators are incorporating it, I imagine it's probably easier for people to move to that from that into manga now.
It's actually kind of funny thinking about this again. And I'm going to go and reference inarguably the most famous manga artist in, in all of Japan, Osamu Tezuka, because a lot of his work, right, can swing wildly. And he's not every artist is like him, but can swing wildly from the most dramatic of topics, like really serious, like gut wrenching things, and then for a panel, it'd be like, "Yeehaw!" Right? Let's have some fun, and then I'll switch back to like dire, like brutal death, and I think that's sort of like huge swings in emotion is something that for a lot of readers can be very very jarring, as well in terms of the visual language aspect.
Yeah, I don't think of it too often, but you don't really see like I don't know, in like what American comics, you don't see like Captain America all of a sudden making a super deformed face when he's surprised, you know? Like there's certain things that are unique to manga and we're so used to it. And then sometimes when I'm confronted with another style of comics, I'm like, oh, well now. Like I feel that way with sometimes with um, I see that sometimes with webtoons. With webtoons, sometimes we'll have reference to a famous Korean comic that I've never read before. I'm trying to collect screenshots because I want to understand what this one visual idiom I see in Korean comics means it's referring to, but I'll have to crowdsource that. So it's well actually let me before there's another question from a viewer saying Kelly Shang is asking, what is the process of handling niche idioms and cultural references? This kind of sounds like something for you, Tomo.
Okay. Um, First thing I do is I translate it as best as I can do without using notes, without writing notes, but sometimes I do have to explain the cultural reference or the history. So then I would write something to as a supplementary information. Like there was this panel in Skip Beat where the character was shouting, "I want it so much that a hand is coming out of my throat." And the visual was that there was a hand coming out of the girl's throat trying to grab the thing that she wanted. And that's an idiom. So I did write a note saying, well, this is a visual expression of the Japanese idiom, blah, 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 blah.
Got it.
And
Gotcha.
with Black Butlers, I sometimes add historical notes about Victorian England.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, Black Butler is a fascinating one, right? Because I remember reading the first chapter, and it's supposed to be in Victorian England, but they have a cell phone.
Right. And there's an Italian mafia in volume 1. So
Yeah,
it's Victorian, but the technology is a little bit advanced.
I was going to say, Janet raised her hand. Did you want to jump in? No? Okay. Let's see. We have another question here from Jane. The question here is a question. It's about hiring process for translators. Do you see a lot of applicants that have language education, whether it's coursework or a full degree in the language? I guess maybe that's something for Connie, maybe?
Actually, the way that we handle hiring translators here at Viz, at least, and I'm not sure if it's the same at other manga publishers, our editors actually do the scouting and hiring of the translators that they want to work with directly. And so the HR team is not super involved in that process. And a lot of times they will get referrals from friends or people that they worked with in the past. So I'm not super involved in that. I can't give them a ton of insight there. But I don't know if that's similar at Yen Carl.
I'll jump in. Yeah, editors are the ones who handle the hiring of freelance translators. And in terms of whether or not you need language courses or formal education, in a way, it both like you can't really necessarily get a beat on someone's Japanese translation skills just because they took courses. It's obviously that you expect them to have a certain baseline, but it's almost like because of the nature of the work of manga translation that you're kind of translating stories and dialogue and all that. Like often, I think we need to have something a little beyond coursework. And again, I guess the idea is that you don't necessarily need to have taken um, Japanese in college, but you definitely, in a way, need something beyond having taken Japanese in college because that prepares you for like having like an extended conversation, right? But doesn't necessarily prepare you for thinking of word choices that would best match a character's personality or the particular word choice that they use, that the character uses, how they conjugate their verbs and such. So it's like if you can manage to obtain that through other means, that is it, ultimately what it comes down to is this quality of the translation. Like we're not gonna, especially for freelance workers, we're not going to disqualify someone for not having a certain level of credentials, but you have to. It's a place where you have to show that you have the skills. You take a test, show that you understand this character's context, that you understand the right words to use, that you haven't confused one kanji for another, stuff like that. Um, if you, at the very least, you should be able to be comfortable with reading and using kanji, which is like Chinese, Chinese derived characters in Japanese language.
Got it. Okay, we have another question here, and this one I think might be a good one for Andrea. From Martha Hansen, she's asking, in general, how are foreign rights handled for manga and comics?
So in our case at Little Brown, they're handled the same way as sort of foreign rights for our prose novels. We have a sub-rights group, and they send them out to different publishers. Generally, it's a lot of European publishers. Interestingly, comics, U.S. Originated comics have been really hard to sell in foreign markets lately. I'm not 100% sure why. I think, I imagine because, the really developed comics markets have their own, style and language. And then you've got like, England, there aren't that many people. I mean, it's just not that big of a market. But yeah, that's what we do. And we make a whole point of getting, translation rights when we acquire them and of setting up our files in such a way that it would be easy to strip the text out and put translated text in.
Got it. Is it, I mean, are there certain things that you have to keep in mind when you're acquiring work from another country, like content or, I mean, what are you, I mean, guess what are you looking for when you're,
I mean, I'm always trying to look at the content. This is like a gross generalization, but there is often a problem with various types of racism in French comics.
mm,
That you really have to look out for, and sometimes you don't see it until the end. You're like, oh no, what are we gonna
Lord.
do? We gotta change this art. I mean, I've been in situations where we've had to just not publish something. We've had to cancel a book
whoa,
a bit long ago, but um, basically just that.
got it. I know maybe Carl, you have some hands-on experience with acquiring
Uh,
foreign rights. Can
yeah,
you speak?
I don't have the I don't usually don't have the final actually no, I ever have the final say in what books get picked up or not. But I think that one of the tricky things is there may be a book that's a huge hit in Japan or has all this history, but it just might not hit the same in the US. I'm not gonna name any specific titles just to make everything kind of make everyone happy. But just like sometimes it's like, oh, there's expectation that's because this book did gangbusters in its original country that's going to do the same in the US, and that's just not necessarily the case because of various cultural aspects, right? And also
Mm,
sometimes it's a matter of time. Like I think about this a lot with this is not like I'm telling this actually this title, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, where I feel like it took time for the fan base, the manga reading fan base, to kind of catch up and develop a certain level of say like almost like fluency, sophistication. Not sure what that's quite the right word to kind of meet where JoJo's is at. And I think that this is why I think JoJo's hitting when it did is very fortuitous. I know, though I understand that there were attempts to publish JoJo in the past, and it did not do great. But I think it took like a new generation of fans, or fans that have had more experience reading manga, to hit a point where they could more readily accept it and make it as the success that it currently is.
mm. The anime didn't hurt either, frankly.
Yeah, that's what I mean. The anime is a huge thing. The anime is a huge thing.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I guess, like, I mean, if you've been reading graphic novels or comics for quite a while, I guess you kind of notice that in the last 20 years, the overall American acceptance of graphic novel content has really evolved quite a bit. Um, it's not the same as France, and it's not the same as Japan, where we're obviously behind, right? In France and Japan, it is like a huge entertainment area. Everyone knows Asterisk, everyone knows Doraemon, everyone knows the names of creators. There are museums dedicated just to manga creators, right? There's manga in the subway, subway. So the cultural, awareness of comics in the marketplace is so different. I guess, I guess maybe I want to ask everyone in general, do you think, like, right now we're in an upswing? Are we going to continue on that, or you think it's going to plateau, or where do you think we're going next with graphic novels publishing?
Upswing to the moon.
And that, given that, what kind of skills should people, if people want to get into this, what kind of skills should they look into acquiring, or what's most important, or what's maybe not you're not seeing enough of that you'd like to see more of from your candidates?
Um, I do want to say this because this comes up a lot in terms of manga editing. Is that learn InDesign, Adobe InDesign. Um, it's basically the standard program that I think most of the manga industry uses for lettering manga. Basically, how to put it, like adapting, cleaning the chapter pages and turning them into pages ready for English usage, laying out balloons. It's just a common tool program, and just having it on your resume will give you a leg up over others because it's used quite often in the industry. That's like very like pragmatic. Just like get in design, learn design. do it through a school program, or maybe you have like a computer lab you practice on in school, or find some meet. Just find a way to familiarize yourself with a program like that.
For early career folks or folks who may still be in school, I think it's a really good opportunity right now because there's so much demand for manga and graphic novel and webcomic content that there's a lot of companies who are publishing more. And that means that they're reaching out to a lot more freelance or temporary or contract positions. And if it's a good way to get your foot in the door with certain smaller publishers that may farm out those tasks, and then you can leverage that experience for a role at a larger publisher down the line. But if you're not able to get that opportunity, a strong English degree, working on your school's literary journals, or any other editorial experience, any internships, it's all helpful to get an understanding of the publishing industry, the editorial process, the conventions, and all of that. It's a good way to get started.
How about you, Andrea?
I mean, it's maybe weird advice, but have an opinion. I think is something that's really important, but also understand that your opinion might not be the same as mine, and that's okay. I feel like a lot of times I'm interviewing people who haven't really thought about the market, which says to me that maybe they haven't spent a lot of time in bookstores and seeing what people are buying. I always want to know, like, what do they think is going to happen next? What do they think we should be publishing more of? And and I understand that people who are just starting their careers, it might not be like a deeply informed from a business perspective opinion, and that's okay. I don't have to agree with them. I just think that it's important, or it's really helpful to have thought about that. Let me also, this is also a somewhat random thing, but a colleague of mine always asks this question in interviews, and I think it's a great question, so it's worth like thinking about beforehand. She always asks, talk about a book that you did not like and why. And I think that's something that I would have a lot of trouble answering. So, and I think people just sort of thinking through what makes something not successful or not successful to you is, I think, important for interviews.
That is a good question. And then I guess maybe we'll close off with one last question from Tyler. He's asking, why do American companies have the rights to all of one publisher's work, like Yen Press does with Square Enix, or Viz does with Jump? Well, I would argue, Tyler, that's not exactly true. Square Enix, Yen has Square Enix, yes, but Square Enix also has their own imprint, and other publishers publish Square Enix. So a lot of the rules just don't apply anymore. Right now, I think I'm going to go and record an episode about Mob Psycho 100, which is a Shogakukan book, which typically is Viz's territory, but Dark Horse published it. So I think it's more wide open than you think. But Tomo, I want to give you a chance to kind of sum up, like, so when you're talking with your students, or I guess when you're being hired, I guess what is the skill that you think you have that has helped you succeed, that is maybe different than what people mostly would think a translator needs to succeed?
Ear for dialogue.
Mm. And how do you acquire that, by the way?
I think what's helped is that I've just read a lot. I've read a lot of books since I was a child, and I've also watched a lot of movies, and I think all that English input has, help me come up with, okay, this is what the character is like in Japanese. How should I make that character speak in English? So, when the reader reads the English dialogue, they will get the same response as a Japanese reader who's reading the original. So yes, so read a lot and listen to a lot of English dialogues. You know, just knowing how kids speak, how women speak, you know, how old people speak, that sort of stuff would really help you coming up with the right sort of translation.
That's a great way. That's a great way sentiment to end out with. So, Janet, I'll throw it to you.
Okay, thank you so much to all of our panelists, Deb for moderating, to Carl and Tomo, Connie, and Andrea for participating in this program. I think you should all join the New York Book Forum, Tomo, because dialogue is everything we do all the time. And you have a real essence for that. And Andrea, when you said have an opinion, you will never meet a group of people that have more opinions than the people at the New York Book Forum. We all have opinions all the time, and we like to share those opinions. So thank you so much for this evening's amazing program. And thank you to Lauren White Jackson and her entire committee for putting this panel together. I want to urge everyone in our audience to consider joining the New York Book Forum. The first 6 months are free, and after that, it's $25 for an individual membership for a year. And this September 10th, we are going to have a picnic on the Great Lawn in Central Park. So if you happen to be in the New York area on September 10th, which is a Saturday at 12 noon, bring a children's book, come into the southwest corner of the Great Lawn near the Delacorte Theater and join us for some companionship and an outdoor in-person meeting, because although these video Zoom conferences are amazing, Google Meets, so on and so forth, it's really nice to see each other in person. So Tomo, you're going to have to start making your travel arrangements right away. But anyway, thank you very much for coming, and have a great evening, and have a good Thursday to you,
Right.
Tomo.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.